She called him her refuge, but he became her nightmare. Imagine the last moments of someone you're sure is a protector, only to realize they're the one ending your life. Tonight, we peel back the layers of a chilling story. A story that ends in tragedy, heartbreak, and a first in American history. This is the case of Amber McLaughlin. Sometimes, you don't have to wait for a crime to find the tragedy. For some, it begins at birth. Amber McLaughlin was born as Scott Andrew McLaughlin in the early winter of 1973. But unlike most newborns, Scott didn't come into a world of warmth and stability. From a very young age, life dealt heavy blows. The kind of blows a child shouldn't have to bear. Abuse, neglect, loneliness. Scott was bounced between foster homes, each transition further fracturing any sense of safety. The very people meant to protect him became the source of fear. He was just a child when he was first introduced to cruelty. One foster parent, someone entrusted with his care, reportedly smeared feces on his face as punishment. Another adult figure, meant to guide and love, tased him like an animal. These weren't just bad memories. They became building blocks in a shattered psyche. Teachers would later describe him as withdrawn, emotionally unstable, lost in his own world. And it's no wonder. When your days are filled with fear and shame, survival becomes your only ambition. He grew up with emotional and neurological scars, suffering from brain damage, learning difficulties, and deep-seated trauma that went untreated. There were glimmers of potential. He could be soft-spoken, helpful, and surprisingly polite. But those moments were fleeting. Scott struggled to form bonds, struggled with himself, and eventually struggled to control his anger. He dropped out of school, drifted into petty crime, and seemed to carry a growing storm within him. In hindsight, the warning signs were there, flashing like neon. But when no one is looking, no one can help. His descent didn't happen overnight. It was a long, painful fall, shaped by abandonment, abuse, and the silent battles of a child begging to be seen. As Scott entered adulthood, the world around him didn't soften. The confusion that haunted his childhood followed him, this time in the form of identity. Deep inside, he didn't feel like Scott. There was a disconnect, an internal battle that he couldn't put into words until much later. He struggled to understand himself and carried shame that he couldn't name. It was more than discomfort. It was a fracture of identity. Years would pass before the world would know her as Amber. But even before the transition, the signs were there. The yearning to feel whole, to be seen, to be accepted not just by others, but by the reflection in the mirror. But there was no guidance, no safe space. Instead, Scott buried that identity beneath layers of self-loathing, rage, and confusion. In prison, long after his crimes, Amber would finally begin to emerge. She would come out as transgender while incarcerated, one of the rarest and most vulnerable things to do inside a male prison system. In an environment already riddled with violence, that choice made her a target. But it was also the first time in her life she truly stepped into who she felt she was. She didn't undergo hormone therapy. She didn't legally change her name. But her identity shifted. She began signing her letters as Amber. She found friendship in others who understood the struggle, trans inmates who saw her, not for her crime, but for the pain she carried. A fellow inmate described her as shy, gentle, someone who loved dad jokes. Can you imagine? In a place built to break people, she was telling dad jokes. That's who Amber became. Someone who, for the first time, smiled not because she was hiding, but because she was beginning to live. But it was too late for redemption. The transformation of identity didn't erase the past. It only added complexity to a case already tangled in pain, judgment, and irreversible choices. Not every love story ends in heartbreak. Some, like this one, end in blood. In the early 2000s, Scott McLaughlin was in a relationship with a woman named Beverly Guenther. She was 45 years old, a kind, steady presence, someone who'd weathered storms of her own. Beverly worked at the University of Missouri-St. Louis, managed her responsibilities well, and kept a close circle of friends. She wasn't reckless with her heart, but sometimes even the most careful people can't predict where love will take them. Her relationship with Scott was complicated. There were moments of tenderness, yes, but they were often overshadowed by volatility, emotional outbursts, and disturbing behavior. Friends would later say Beverly seemed tense around Scott, uneasy, like she was always looking over her shoulder. It didn't take long for things to spiral. After they broke up, Scott didn't take it well. In fact, he unraveled. He began stalking her, first with phone calls, then uninvited appearances. He'd show up at her work, watch from afar, or wait in his car outside. At one point, he even broke into her office and hid there, terrifying her when she arrived the next morning. Beverly did what many women in her situation are told to do. She sought help. She got a restraining order. She told people close to her that she feared for her life, and she had every reason to. Scott had become obsessed, possessive, and erratic. He wasn't letting go. He was preparing to strike. Then came November 20th, 2003. That night, Beverly didn't come home. Her car was still parked outside her office. Her purse, phone, all left behind. When she didn't show up for work the next morning, friends called the police. What they found was every family's worst nightmare. A broken knife handle on the ground, bloodstains, signs of a struggle, a desperate, violent act committed in the shadows. And then, silence. It wasn't until the next day that the full horror unfolded. Beverly's body was discovered near the Mississippi River. She had been raped, stabbed multiple times, and left to die alone. Her life ended not in a moment of rage, but in a planned, vengeful act by someone she once trusted. And the most haunting part? Scott knew exactly where her body was. He led authorities there himself. There was no pretense of innocence, only a hollow confession. The stalking had become a murder, the love an execution. And for Beverly, who'd done everything right, who tried to protect herself, justice would now take center stage. But not without a long, difficult road ahead. Trials are supposed to be where justice is served, where evidence is weighed, and the truth, no matter how dark, comes to light. But for Scott McLaughlin, and for the family of Beverly Guenther, this courtroom would become the stage for something far more complex than guilt and innocence. By the time the trial began in 2006, the facts of the crime were not in question. Scott had confessed. He had led police to Beverly's body. The prosecution had forensic evidence, a clear motive, and a trail of behavior that painted an unmistakable picture of obsession turned fatal. The jury heard how Scott stalked Beverly for weeks, how he violated restraining orders, how he ultimately attacked her, raped her, stabbed her, and dumped her like she was nothing. The details were graphic, cold, unrelenting. Prosecutors didn't hold back. They wanted the death penalty, and they believed this case deserved it. They presented Scott as a monster, someone incapable of remorse, driven by violent impulses, and unworthy of life. But the defense had another story. They tried to pull back the curtain on Scott's childhood, the trauma, the abuse, the untreated mental illness. They argued that Scott was not a born killer, but a damaged soul shaped by decades of pain. They spoke of the foster homes, the physical and sexual abuse, the brain damage, the deep psychological disorders. They pleaded for mercy. Then came the sentencing phase, and this is where the case took a turn few expected. The jury, after hearing all the testimony and all the pain, couldn't agree. They deadlocked. They couldn't unanimously decide on death. In most states, that would have meant life in prison. But Missouri plays by different rules. In Missouri, if a jury can't reach a unanimous verdict on sentencing, the judge decides. And in this case, the judge made his decision without hesitation. He sentenced Scott McLaughlin to death. It was a jarring moment, one that left even legal experts unsettled. A single person had overruled a jury's indecision and handed down the ultimate punishment. The courtroom was silent. Scott, quiet, eyes down. Beverly's family, stone-faced, holding back years of grief. Justice had spoken, but the echoes of that sentence would carry on for nearly 2 decades. When the gavel came down and the sentence of death was pronounced, it wasn't the end of Scott McLaughlin's story. It was the beginning of a long and bitter legal battle. One that would stretch across courts, years, and questions much larger than guilt. Almost immediately after sentencing, Scott's legal team began filing appeals. The cornerstone of their argument was something deeply familiar in capital cases: ineffective counsel. They claimed that Scott's original defense attorneys failed to fully present the scope of his trauma and mental illness. They had only scratched the surface of a life defined by abuse and neglect. No neuropsychological tests, no expert testimony about his cognitive disabilities. Nothing that might have explained, not excused, but explained how someone could get from childhood scars to adult monstrosity. Years passed in legal limbo. In 2016, a federal judge finally agreed. The court vacated the death sentence, not the conviction, but the sentence. It was a rare win, a small sliver of hope. The judge ruled that Scott's original lawyers had indeed failed to provide adequate defense during sentencing. The door cracked open to the possibility of life imprisonment instead of execution. But that door would be slammed shut soon after. In 2021, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed the lower court's decision. They reinstated the death sentence, arguing that even if the original defense had been better, the outcome likely wouldn't have changed. The brutal facts of the crime, they said, outweighed the mitigating factors. That decision was crushing for Scott's defense team and polarizing in the public eye. Some believed it was a just reaffirmation of punishment. Others saw it as a missed opportunity for nuance, a refusal to confront the deeper questions of trauma, identity, and mental health in the justice system. Scott's lawyers took their case to the U.S. Supreme Court, hoping the highest court in the land would see what others had missed. But the court declined to hear it. No explanation, no dissenting opinions, just silence. And with that, the legal path narrowed. The sentence of death loomed once more. But even as the courts turned cold, support from advocacy groups began to grow. Civil rights organizations, mental health experts, even former Missouri judges began speaking out. They weren't excusing the crime, but they questioned the process. Should a judge have the power to impose death when a jury cannot agree? Should the worst moments of someone's life, especially when rooted in mental illness and trauma, be ignored in sentencing? These were no longer just legal questions. They were moral ones, philosophical, personal. And as the execution date crept closer, the weight of those questions grew heavier with each passing day. As the execution date neared, January 3, 2023, the tone around Scott McLaughlin's case began to shift from legal analysis to something more visceral. It was no longer just about crime and punishment. It was about identity, redemption, and the role of mercy in a justice system often accused of being merciless. By now, Scott was living openly as Amber McLaughlin, having transitioned while incarcerated. This fact, while not central to the crime or the legal proceedings, brought new attention and scrutiny to the case. If Missouri went through with the execution, Amber would become the first openly transgender person executed in U.S. history. The media caught on. Headlines changed. Editorials began to appear in newspapers across the country. Civil rights groups mobilized. LGBTQ+ advocates, mental health professionals, and anti-death penalty activists joined forces, not to erase the brutal murder of Beverly Guenther, but to ask, is this justice or another failure of compassion? Amber's legal team submitted a clemency petition to Missouri Governor Mike Parson, arguing that Amber suffered from profound mental illness and had been failed at every step. By her family, by the foster system, by mental health institutions, and finally, by the courts. They detailed years of horrific abuse, being tased as a child, raped by her adoptive father, and suffering from brain damage and depression. They also pointed out that the jury never voted unanimously for death, a detail that, to them, cried out for mercy. Dozens of letters poured into the governor's office, from former judges, from clergy, from people who believed in the sanctity of life, even in the face of darkness. Amber is not the same person who committed that crime, one letter read. She is deeply remorseful, mentally ill, and does not deserve to die. But there were voices on the other side too, equally passionate. Beverly Guenther's family had lived with the pain of her murder for nearly 2 decades. To them, Amber's identity or troubled past did not excuse the horror she inflicted. Beverly had begged for protection. She had called the police. She had gotten a restraining order, and none of it saved her. What kind of message would it send, they asked, if someone could commit such a violent, premeditated crime and be spared? The governor listened, or at least his office did. But on January 3, 2023, Governor Parson announced his decision. Clemency was denied. His statement was short and resolute. McLaughlin is a violent criminal. Beverly Guenther's family and loved ones deserve peace. The state of Missouri will carry out the sentence, according to the court's order. It was over. Amber McLaughlin was scheduled to die that evening. A flurry of last-minute legal appeals were filed, but they went nowhere. No stays, no delays, no final-hour reprieve. The countdown had begun, and the world was watching. January 3rd, 2023. The temperature in Bonne Terre, Missouri, was just above freezing. Quiet, cold, and still. But inside the walls of the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center, the final preparations were underway. Amber McLaughlin had reached the end of the line. At 6 p.m., Amber was escorted to the execution chamber. The ritual was painfully familiar to the prison staff, measured, mechanical, and somber. But to the outside world, this execution carried a chilling weight. This wasn't just the story of a murderer meeting her sentence. It was history being made, for reasons that extended far beyond the confines of the prison. Amber wore the standard gray prison uniform, her hair long, her expression composed. She declined a special last meal. Instead, she received the same meal as everyone else in the facility. There were no extravagant requests, no dramatic statements to the press, just quiet. When asked for her final words, Amber spoke softly but clearly. "I'm sorry for what I did. I'm a loving and caring person." Her voice didn't tremble, but those words hung in the room. Some heard contrition, others heard an evasion. Still, they were her last. A few steps away, the family of Beverly Guenther sat quietly behind the glass. They had waited nearly 20 years for this moment. Their pain was etched into every glance, every deep breath, every held hand. They hadn't come to celebrate a death. They had come, perhaps, to end a chapter. At 6:51 p.m., the lethal dose of pentobarbital was administered. There was no struggle, no resistance, just a slow, methodical fading. By 6:54 p.m., Amber was pronounced dead. And with that, Missouri became the first state in U.S. history to execute a transgender woman. The prison released a brief statement. The governor's office followed suit, reaffirming the decision. There was no fanfare, no ceremony, no loud proclamations, just finality. But the public reaction was anything but quiet. Civil rights groups expressed outrage. The ACLU condemned the execution, calling it a travesty of justice. LGBTQ+ advocacy organizations described it as a sobering example of how gender identity intersects with criminal justice and how often compassion is in short supply. Others pointed out that the justice system had again failed to protect both victim and perpetrator. First when it didn't save Beverly, and again when it refused to fully consider Amber's mental illness and trauma. For Beverly Guenther's family, the message was simpler. Justice had finally been served. After nearly 2 decades of courtrooms, delays, and headlines, the man who took her life was now gone. They issued a quiet statement, thanking the governor and law enforcement. They did not attend press interviews. And Amber? Her story ended where it began, in silence. From a childhood no one protected, to a life spiraling through pain, violence, and ultimately, capital punishment, hers was a journey marked by contradiction. A murderer, yes, but also a victim, a person seeking identity, redemption, maybe peace. It was a case that forced many to ask uncomfortable questions. Can someone be both monstrous and broken? Can justice be blind and still be just? Can a system that rarely offers grace ever truly claim moral high ground? Those answers remain elusive. But one thing is certain: Amber McLaughlin's execution marked more than the end of a life. It marked the beginning of a national reckoning. In the days following Amber McLaughlin's execution, Missouri returned to its routine. The headlines faded, the protests cooled, and yet, for many, something about this case continued to linger, like a bruise just beneath the surface. What do we do with broken people who do terrible things? What responsibility does society bear when abuse creates abusers? These weren't easy questions. They weren't meant to excuse what Amber did. Beverly Guenther deserved every ounce of empathy and mourning. Amber McLaughlin's name is etched in American history now, not just because of how she died, but because of what her life represented. Pain, violence, identity, and the collision between who we are, who we become, and who the system says we deserve to be. Some will see her as a killer who got what she deserved. Others will see her as a tragic figure, a case study in how deeply society can fail. And maybe, just maybe, both are true. They say justice is blind, that it doesn't care who you are, only what you've done. But the truth is never that simple. Amber McLaughlin was executed for a crime that tore a woman's life away. Beverly Guenther's memory deserves every breath of justice. Her voice, her pain, her cries for help, they matter more than words can say. But this story wasn't just about death. It was about broken systems and broken people. About a child who was never safe, a teen who never found peace, and an adult who spiraled beyond redemption. In the end, we are left with a single, heavy question. Can justice truly be served in a world where healing never had a chance to begin? This case wasn't black and white. It was blood red and bruised blue. It was a map of scars stretching across lives, courts, prisons, and hearts. And as Amber McLaughlin took her final breath, the world didn't change. But for just a moment, maybe. We all looked a little deeper. Thank you for watching this episode on True Crime Briefing. If this story stirred something in you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. We uncover the truths behind the headlines, even when they hurt. Because every victim deserves to be remembered, and every story deserves to be told. We'll see you in the next one.